Welcome back. Just continuing on from where we left off, doing some welding and just getting this bonnet tacked up and ready for some panel beating. And you can see here, when the bonnet's turned over, it's starting to look a lot better on the flip side. And just drilling some holes here for some plug welding, just so that all the spot welds are maintained on the top side. and you won't know this has even been done unless you lift up the lid, and even then most of this will be just flapper disc back to flat, so it'll be very hard to pick up. And I'm welding the seams and that as well on the back of these lids where these braces got torn off. These will actually be a lot stronger than what they are, well, what they were when they left the factory, with everything welded into each other. These were one of the many weak points of the early construction. But they were probably fine if you were just putting down a English lane somewhere with the dog in the front seat. But when they were out here, a lot of the times, especially when they got to 15 and 20 years old, they were used as spotlighting rigs. And you can imagine a big fella with the seat cushion out standing on these things with his rifle over the front windscreen and bouncing around on some of these rough paddocks. And you just put your foot straight through them. The lids are one of those things that are the pluses and minuses of early Land Rover construction. They're lightweight from the Burma bright, made them really good off-road, but they weren't as durable for flex and all that sort of stuff. They'd crack quite easily. I mean, sometimes you have to scratch your head, especially when you're mucked around with a lot of early Land Rovers and you see where they changed things. And you know that, especially when they landed here in Australia, that a lot of these things would have been broken and cracked by the time they got home from the dealer, because the roads were some of the most corrugated in the world, and the dealer was like 400 or 500 mile away. And by the time they got home, the radiator support would be cracked and all of these sort of things from the flex and the corrugations. And it just took, you know, well, it took 4 or 5 years for them to put the later 86-inch type seats in that went over the top of these things so that there was no stress on them. And you just know that people that bought them would have been cursing from day one with all of this sort of stuff cracking and going wrong, because they would have been used back in the day, not like now. Like most of these, especially all these new Toyotas and stuff, most of them never even see the off-road. They wouldn't even see dirt. But back then, when you bought a four-wheel drive, it was going to be used, that's for sure. And it's amusing, after being into them for so long, one of the old digs from the Toyota owners was back in the day how Land Rovers and everyone bailed out of them into Toyotas is because they wouldn't change, you know, the old stupid sliding windows and all that sort of stuff, and Toyota sort of leaped ahead. But Toyota's making exactly the same mistake now. They've got their 70 series have just running axle sizes that are different front to back, and there's just a multitude of things that all of those owners are whinging about. And it's quite funny to see it go full circle. But the amusing part is that with the 70 series, they started out at $30,000. It's still basically the same car 30 or 40 years on. And now they're getting 110 for them. So, I mean, who's the silly one? Toyota's laughing all the way to the bank. No R&D, and yeah, they're basically doing nothing. They just put a later model engine in and some electronics, and it's the same vehicle. It is quite incredible that they've got away with what they have. And not to be biased, you know, Land Rover got away with it with the Defender as well. Like, you know, I've owned Defenders and had nothing but Defenders for 25, 30 years. And drove them every day, and you know, Defender doors and all the other issues with Defenders. But at least the Defender was a serious four-wheel drive off-road. So you were prepared to put up with all those little idiosyncrasies from the Land Rover Defenders, or at least I was for a long time. But I enjoy the Disco now because you get all the comfort, and it's got the same platform underneath it. You know, and I've gone full circle as well with that, because I used to buy the Discos I'd buy from auction wrecked or whatever, and I used to wreck them out to build my Defenders and all that sort of thing. But that's gone full circle, and I wouldn't wreck one out to build a Defender now, that's for sure. I mean, partly because, for me, partly because everyone's got a Defender now, that's a bit boring, so it's good to be into the Discos, but the Disco's just, you know, to be fair, is a lot better car for your general off-roading, especially because it's the 100-inch wheelbase. But the Defender's a lot better. Like if you were travelling on the world in a Land Rover, you'd still go the Defender because they load modular. And that was the big thing when we travelled around Australia for decades, is you know, we could fit just mountains of gear in that Defender because of the way it loaded. But the whole off-road scene has gone crazy now, like everyone's into it. Back in the day, hardly anyone went and travelled around Australia, but now it's the new cool thing to do. And if you're not spending 300k on a palatial caravan and a huge GMC or a Dodge Ram, well, you're just not in the race. But anyone that's ever travelled knows that if you're doing that sort of thing, you're not going to see half the stuff you're going to see in a nice, light, agile vehicle with the minimum of gear that you can get out and see what you want. You've got no limitations. But I can only imagine the limitations of the big banger Chevy and the huge 40-foot palatial caravan. And these little 80 inches, they copped, the farmers used to load those up like they were some sort of freight train. And yeah, no wonder they got so broken, you know, in the panels and all that sort of thing. They'd be so overloaded, it was just crazy. One of the cool things about hunting down all these early Land Rovers in the outback is all the cool stories of them in their early days and what used to be done with them. And, you know, a lot of the older fellas were just, you know, still around and able to tell you the stories of what they used to do to them back in the 60s and 70s when they were, you know, 10 or 15 years old. Like, yeah, the amount of things that they used to convert these things for and do is just unbelievable. I bought a nice little 1949 from Central Victoria, and that guy was a croc hunter in the late 60s, early 70s, and him and his brother used to drive from Central Victoria around these lights behind the grill up north into the Gulf and shoot crocs for about 6 or 7 months a year. That's when they used to shoot the crocs. And the stories, and this thing was just going backwards and forwards all the time. The incredible part was it had a changeover engine. It had a side plate in it, which is a rare early Land Rover engine. And this thing was still totally original, and it just must have racked up huge amounts of kilometres running backwards and forwards to the Gulf. Like, you just wouldn't imagine doing that, you know, I mean, in an early 80 now. You know, you do it for a bit of fun and some YouTube posting, but these guys are doing it every day and using this thing every day. And the reason they stuck with the 80-inch is because all the other four-wheel drives just couldn't get into that soft marshy area up the top in the Gulf like the little 80-inch. And you could lift it out and manoeuvre it when they got stuck. And there was some really, really great stories that went with that vehicle. Dragging out and winching with the capstan big crocs out of the mangroves and draping them over the back of the 80-inch, and yeah, just, you can only imagine. Yeah, it's one of those things you just wish you had the photos or the videos. It sort of makes YouTube look a bit bland.